A wicked woman built 120 houses on my land, then claimed I was disrupting the project? Fine. I'll help her exit society as quickly as possible. Then I'll bury the entire trash heap of an HOA. Celia Maris, surveyor, right after reinstalling the private land sign in the middle of the construction site where they were live streaming a sales event. 3 days later, all transactions were frozen, their lawyers disappeared, and Celia Thorn, the same person who once boasted, "We've already been approved," was now knocking on the courthouse door begging for a hearing. When she crossed that boundary, she didn't just walk onto my land, she stepped directly into the legal trap I set 3 years ago. What state are you in? Is your land being interfered with or exploited by some force right now? Early in the morning, the wind rustled across the vacant land, still marked by dry dust left from the heavy excavator wheels the day before. Celia Maris bent down, gripping an old wooden mallet, hammering steady, firm blows into the iron post, now set in concrete since the previous day. The weathered sign had been cleaned down to every faded streak of paint. The words "Private Land Parcel 191" now stood out clearly on the gray-white background, towering at the eastern edge of the construction site, buzzing with machinery. No one noticed the man at first until a white SUV screeched to a stop by the roadside like yanked back by a tow line. Celia Thorn stepped out, her heels digging into the damp ground, eyes scanning the sign as if she had just seen something filthy standing in the middle of her model project. "What right do you have to put that thing here?" she snapped. No greeting, no explanation. Celia stood up straight, brushed the dust off his sleeve, then turned and looked her square in the eye, calm and unshaken. "The right of someone granted ownership since 1985, he replied, his voice even and familiar, like reciting a well-known passage. "The paperwork's been submitted to the county planning office, certified and mapped. You can request a copy if you need one." "Oh." Celia scoffed, eyes full of contempt if he had just told an old joke. "You really think one rotten, abandoned piece of land from decades ago can stop 120 houses?" She said, arms crossed, head tilted, tone both mocking and hostile. In the distance, workers in reflective vests kept installing water lines for unit number 34. No one paused, but everyone was clearly watching. A man from the HOA, in a blue button-up holding a phone, walked up and pointed the camera at the sign Celia had just planted. "Zoom in," Celia ordered, eyes fixed on the man in front of her. Then she pointed directly at the post. "Take it down, or you'll be fined for installing an unauthorized obstruction on public land. I have full development approval over this entire area, signed by the project council. If you need a copy, I am happy to attach it to the removal order." Elior did not move. His hand still lightly gripped the mallet, his gaze unflinching. "You do not need to take the sign down," he said, voice low but every word crisp. "You have already set 120 traps on someone else's land." The air stilled. The HOA staff filming froze mid-record. A car horn sounded in the distance, but no one seemed to register it. Celia's face shifted in an instant, her expression unsettled not from fear, but because for one fleeting second, she had nothing to say. She knew she had never checked the boundary record, never verified the old survey, never once asked anyone about the name Celia Maris in the land registry. She trusted a map rebuilt 3 years ago, modified by an internal team of engineers, and believed the authority of the HOA could paper over any legal flaws if needed. But now, the presence of one sign and one man was enough to open a fracture, one that, once revealed, would spread like a crack in a foundation poured before the concrete had time to set. "You are obstructing our construction schedule." Celia stepped back, taking a breath as if to regain her rhythm. "If you continue resisting, I will have someone remove you from here." Elior bent down, tightened the bolts securing the base of the sign, and did not look up. "I am not stopping anyone. I am simply marking what they have forgotten, that land, once owned, is not something that can be overlapped through carelessness and pride." A small cement truck approached. The driver, seeing the scene ahead, eased the wheel, slowing down and looking toward the HOA staff, as if waiting for direction, but no one gestured. Celia slowly turned back toward her car, placed her hand on the door handle, but did not open it. She turned her head slightly, her voice now subdued. "You really think one sign will convince anyone that you are the true owner of this land?" Elior stood upright, brushed the dust from his hands. "I do not need anyone to believe. I only need one person to ask the right court, and your entire project will have to stop to prove something you never even thought to question." The SUV door shut with a heavy thud. A cloud of dust rose as the car drove away, but the sign remained standing, right in the middle of the lot enclosed by temporary fencing, facing the row of houses now having their roofs installed. On the face of the sign, 3 bold words, repainted by hand but perfectly aligned, read, "Private land." The wind tugged at the edge of Ellier's jacket, but his gaze did not shift. He kept looking toward the new foundations, where steel pillars had been driven into the soil that, 30 years ago, his father had mapped with red-painted stakes and hand-drawn blueprints. He did not need to shout, did not need to raise a fist. He only had to stand where he belonged, and let them cross the line themselves, a line not drawn in dirt, but etched in the arrogance of those who believe the law only applies to those beneath them. From afar, a hoarse bird called out, lost in the rumble of construction noise, and in the pale morning light, the rusted sign once seen for years as an obstacle now stood as the first boundary marker in a legal battle no one expected to begin with a single, firm strike of a hammer. But Ellier knew this was just the beginning, and when someone like Celia is too sure of her victory, that is exactly the moment she steps into the trap, one not set by anger, but built from every measured centimeter of boundary that had been surveyed and held. In the soft afternoon light, Ellier sat in his father's old garage, once used as a woodworking shop and a storage space for technical documents across 3 generations. A thin layer of dust coated the dark wooden shelves, while light from a bare filament bulb cast a faint glow on the cover of a worn brown leather notebook. He opened it carefully, as if touching something still alive, and stopped at a yellowed hand-drawn map. On the large sheet of paper, red ink lines curved around simple but precise symbols: property boundaries, underground water veins, wooden stakes. A scribbled block of uppercase letters ran diagonally across one corner. It read, "Never C, L, keep the water line." The ink had smudged, but the intent was clear. The land was preserved not for its commercial value but out of technical responsibility, the kind Ellier had been taught since the day he first recognized his name on a blueprint. He ran his hand over the area, marked 191, then took out his phone to capture a full photo of the original map. Through simple yet tightly structured symbols, his father had outlined the entire terrain, including the core section now being drilled for foundation piles by the HOA's model home units. The underground water line passed directly through that section. If sealed off by deep foundations and heavy concrete structures, it would not only shift the ground but also destroy the subterranean ecosystem, something any true engineer would flag as critical. But no one mentioned it. No notes were attached. Not a single warning existed in the files submitted by the HOA to the county. That meant either they did not know or they deliberately chose not to. Ellier brought the documents to meet a surveyor who had previously worked with the project's development team. The meeting took place at a small cafe behind the city library, a quiet spot where even silences between technical people could be heard. The surveyor was in his early 40s, worn out, with blue ink stains still visible on his fingers. When Ellier laid out the map, the man stared at it for a long moment before nodding. "I have seen this layout before, but it was not in the file submitted to the Planning Commission. I was told to ignore boundary 191. Ellier tilted his head. "Who told you?" 1 second of silence. Then the answer came out soft and sharp, like a clean slice. "The chairwoman. She said the documents had been updated with a new version from the internal advisory team. No need to review the old ones. We just followed instructions and used the pre-plotted GPS markers." "No one on the survey team pushed back?" Ellier asked. The engineer exhaled, shaking his head. "An engineer who pushes back gets replaced. They do not hire us to argue. We measure, they sign. That is it." That night, Ellier received an email from the HOA office inviting him to a private meeting to discuss a cooperative approach to resolving the dispute. The meeting location was the 3rd floor of the administration building, a white structure with glass windows that stayed lit even after business hours. Ellier arrived on time, said little. A young assistant opened the door and led him into a small room with a map of the full project on the wall, a gold-framed board, and a round table with space for only 3 chairs. Celia entered shortly after, not wearing her usual badge, her hair tied neatly, holding a thin file folder in one hand. "We want to settle," she began, cutting straight to the point. "If you stay quiet and take the sign down within 48 hours, we will transfer a compensation amount equal to the current market value of the affected parcel." She slid the folder across the table toward Ellier. "There is no need to make this a big deal. No one wins if this goes public." Ellier did not touch the document. He simply pulled a small device from his jacket pocket and placed it on the wooden tabletop. A red recording light blinked on. Celia looked down, her brow tensing. For the record, Elier said, I am recording this entire meeting, as per standard protocol, with both parties aware and present. The space tightened like a door had just sealed shut. Celia froze for a second, then leaned back into her chair, hands locking over her legs. You think having an engineering license is enough to play legal games with us? Her voice was sharp as a blade. You really believe a few outdated drawings, one rusted sign, and some hand-painted words saying private land will bring this whole system to a stop? Elier leaned forward. I am not smarter than this system, he said, eyes fixed on her. I just measure more precisely than the people who laid it out wrong. Outside the glass window, light rain had begun to fall. A drop ran down the pane, pulling a trail through the settled dust. No one said another word for nearly a minute. The master plan map behind Celia still hung straight, but Elier knew that if a courtroom followed proper procedure, every line on that map would be brought back into question, every boundary, every trace they had deliberately left out. And that might not just delay a project. It could expose how an entire system had legalized its mistakes through belief in power alone. Elier left the office just as the hallway lights began to dim. In his hand was a copy of the request to reopen the land records for Parcel 191, now with a sworn statement from a technical staff member. Part of him wanted to file it that same night, but he knew the longer they believed he had gone quiet, the heavier the impact would be. And sometimes, patience is what forces the first mistake from the other side. Behind the wheel of his old pickup, Elier glanced into the rearview mirror. The HOA administrative building sat quietly in the background, scattered light flickering through the rain. His hand gripped the steering wheel, not from anger, but because this fight had never been about money. It was about limits, and about what someone once wrote on a map: never sell, keep the waterline. A handwritten sentence, but the only one no one had dared to erase. The first message came on Wednesday afternoon, sent to the phone of an acquaintance from the alumni network of the engineering school Elier once attended. The subject line was vague and anonymous. Internal HOA warning, landowner impersonator. Attached was a strange image that immediately made Elier's breath catch. He stood next to the private land Parcel 191 sign, but in the background was a construction vehicle, and the photo had been color-edited with a yellow tint, blurring the outlines to suggest illegality. Beneath the image, a bold caption read, "Black male sets up fake sign to pressure a residential development. HOA is coordinating with local authorities." There was no sender name, no verified source, but the narrative was unmistakable. Elier stared at the photo like facing a warped version of himself. They could not disprove the map, nor deny the technical boundaries, so they turned to something easier to manipulate: public perception. He had anticipated this, but not so soon or so bluntly. It did not appear in public media, but in internal circles, where half-spoken rumors spread faster than official records. A Facebook group for new residents in the project area began circulating posts asking, "Who is that guy? Why is he blocking approved housing work? Has anyone ever seen him live here?" 2 days later, a man in construction gear showed up at the old worksite near where Elier had remained stationed. He said little, just held out his phone. On the screen, a low, steady voice played, "Tell him I am ready to offer 10,000. Not because he is right, but because I need him gone from that land. If not, his name will not stay clean. First article goes live next week." The worker then handed over a white envelope, a corner of a $100 bill visible, placing it at the foot of the sign like performing a ritual already rehearsed. Elier bent down, picked up the envelope, opened it, and counted it 50 bills, the exact amount. He pulled out one bill, slipped it into his shirt pocket, and returned the rest. "Take it back. When you bury the boundary wrong, and bury the law with it, your next step is to bury my name?" His voice was calm, not raised, but cold enough to make the worker step back. "Go tell whoever sent you this. This sign is driven 60 centimeters deep with gravel, set concrete, and I earned my engineering license in 2009, graduated with honors. I do not need money from a system that abuses authority and forges records." The worker left without another word, but within hours, Elier's personal email was flooded with attacks. Spam, strange links, requests to verify your account from untraceable sites. He shut down his secondary inbox, disconnected from the internal network. Then came the final step. He reopened the archive from his father, rescanned it using dedicated equipment to avoid any errors, and pulled up the city planning department's official website. The first lawsuit was filed at 2:17 in the morning. He clearly stated in the attachment section, I, Elier Maris, submit to your office the original map defining the boundaries of Parcel 191, drawn and notarized in the year 1985, federally verified, which is currently being illegally encroached upon by a housing development organization named Thorn Residential Group, using false information to distort the ownership record. I respectfully request an urgent investigation, an immediate suspension of all construction activities related to the disputed area, and a public release of the official land survey records for this parcel. The attached files included the hand-drawn map from 1985, a certified stamp, current photos of the boundary markers, a protest letter with a full audio recording of the attempted bribery negotiation, and a copy of the defamatory email that had circulated internally. He hit send without hesitation. At that moment, the sky outside his window had just shifted from the deep black of night to the pale gray of early morning. A construction vehicle rolled by, but he did not turn his head. Because he knew the battle was no longer at the edge of the land, it was now at the final boundary between personal honor and systemic abuse. In the silent room, only the soft sputtering of an old printer could be heard. Elier remained seated at the desk, his eyes fixed on the final line of the filing. No one should have to choose between silence and their own honor, and I, as the inheritor of this land, choose honor. It was a sentence he wrote himself, without edits, and it was the only sentence he wanted to remain in every file going forward, no matter how long this case dragged on. Because for Elier, if they could not break the land he stood on, they would try to break him instead. But what they forgot was this. A man with deep roots cannot be uprooted by a passing wind, and honor, once wagered, is something no one can take unless he gives it away himself. That morning, light rain fell. The drops were sparse, enough to soak a shirt but not enough to wash away the dull sting inside the man holding a thick stack of inked pages. A legal officer in a raincoat knocked on Elier's door just before 8 o'clock, his face blank, his voice steady as if reading from a script. Mr. Maris, this is a notice from the county judge's office, requiring you to temporarily cease access to the construction area of Parcel 191 for 30 days, based on an emergency motion filed by representatives of the HOA. Elier paused for a moment. Then he glanced at the paper, scanning the listed reason: disturbing public order, obstructing economic activity, and engaging in behavior that made others feel threatened at the site. He raised his eyebrows but said nothing to the messenger, simply nodded, closed the door, and stepped inside as if making space for the absurdity of what had just been declared. In the kitchen, the kettle spilled a few drops onto the gas stove, hissing with dry tension. He pulled out his phone and immediately sent a response to his attorney. One line only. I've just been barred from land I legally hold the title to. The HOA Council's internal hearing took place 2 days later. The meeting room was inside the North Creek Management Office, a glass-walled space with project diagrams pinned across every wall. Celia Thorn stood in the center, her face calm to the point of blankness. She raised her hand to speak first, clearly stating, "We filed for the injunction because on-site security reported that Mr. Maris behaved in a threatening manner, blocked construction vehicles, and placed signage without authorization, creating a risk of disruption to a large-scale project that serves public interest." Elier sat across from her, gripping his folder of notes. When it was his turn to speak, he did not look at the papers. He said only one sentence. "Is there a video or any evidence showing that I threatened anyone?" The room fell silent. Not a single council member spoke. No one offered a clip, and Celia said nothing more. That silence was more than the absence of proof. It was the sound of a system leaning on sentiment, trying to legitimize power by redefining the actions of those who oppose it, as if Elier planting a private land sign was a form of aggression. But more dangerous was the quiet agreement. They knew there was no evidence, yet they signed the order anyway. Because the longer Elier was kept away from the site, the more time they had to push construction forward, and once the buildings were finished, any lawsuit would be dismissed as a mere afterthought. That same day, Elier filed a counter-motion with the county court. In it, he wrote, "I do not ask the court to verify my actions, but to verify the boundary of the land I own, a legal entity, recorded and notarized since 1985, never revoked or altered. All accusations about character or motive should be postponed until the land boundary is clearly confirmed on official administrative maps and federal survey systems." He used no emotional language, made no appeal to personal harm. He simply asked the court to face reality. Land is land, markers are markers, and honor cannot be judged by tone. On the way home, as his truck stopped at a red light, a middle-aged man in the back seat of a black SUV stared at him for a long time. That man was Brian Keach, a longtime member of the HOA, who once served as an internal auditor before taking early retirement for health reasons. That afternoon, in a closed-door side meeting, when asked about the risk if Parcel 191 turned out to be privately owned rather than part of the HOA, he leaned over and quietly said to the person beside him, "If he's right, we just built an entire neighborhood on a legal minefield." That sentence spread quickly within the organization, like the first crack in the artificial wall of certainty Celia was still trying to maintain. Elliot did not know about that whisper in the moment, but he could sense something was shifting. People began to hesitate when speaking about him, no longer calling him that engineer who came back to sabotage the project, but instead referring to him by name Lior Maris. A few emails from new residents started coming in. Some apologized for having shared the smear post, and others asked to see the original map. The shift did not make him feel victorious, but it was a signal. A person who speaks the truth, if he keeps his reasoning clear, will gradually expose the fault lines in the other side's logic. That evening, Elliot sat down again with his father's old map. For the first time, he took out a ruler and a transit to recheck every marked point. Beneath each red ink line was a story, about the weather during the survey, about the soil type tested, about how his father had carefully recorded the location of the water veins to avoid future sinkage, not because they feared erosion, but because they respected the natural structure of the land they lived on. And that was exactly what the current system had forgotten. They built houses, but not decency into the foundation. A person can be banned from setting foot on the land they stand for, but truth cannot be pushed away with a court order, and that paradox that a landowner could be barred from his own land was the spark that would soon feed a larger storm. Because the public does not only watch the law, they watch the collapse of false narratives. And once the question who truly owns Parcel 191 is loud enough, every injunction will become nothing more than a damp piece of paper in the downpour of consequences. The mid-June sun spilled over the northern hills of the city, lighting up the old pine ridges that once marked the boundary between farmland and late-stage residential development. In the midst of that landscape, a new billboard had been raised. Heritage Bluffs, where generations of excellence begin. Below was a three-dimensional model of the entire residential area, nearing completion 120 modern homes, anchored on bedrock, lined along the windy slope, clearly numbered from Lot 1 to Lot 120. The only thing the map did not show was that the boundary of Parcel 191 ran through nearly 1/4 of the project's entire footprint and completely covered lots, numbered 58 through 83. The launch event was staged like a production, with a red ribbon-cutting line, a reception table laid with white wine, and thick stacks of pre-sale contract copies. Local television was present, cameras panning across a site still under construction but already paved with concrete slabs and reinforced steel. Celia Thorn wore a cream blazer, stepped onto the podium, her smile unwavering through a 3-minute speech. Heritage Bluffs is the pride of North Creek. We are not just building houses. We are building a new community where every resident is safe, connected, and legally settled. Every mention of the word legally landed like a deliberate strike at the unresolved dispute. Elliot stood at a distance, on higher ground just outside the edge of the event site, watching like someone witnessing a wedding party being held over his ancestor's grave. He was not angry, did not intervene, and filed no formal objection. When a friend called to ask, "They've started building, are you going to stop them?" Elliot simply answered, "If they keep going, I won't stop them. I'm just waiting for the day they'll have to take down each brick like they're undoing a lie." He understood the position. Once they built, they locked themselves into wrongdoing, and the evidence he had submitted to the court would no longer be theoretical. It would become the foundation for holding each person accountable. But on the other side, Celia continued making her moves as if convinced of victory. She appeared on the Saturday Evening News, giving an interview in studio. When asked about the land dispute, she smiled. "People like Mr. Maris are just trying to exploit loopholes in the system to delay our progress. This land has been zoned, recognized by the previous council, and approved through the proper channels. What he's doing is a personal scheme. It does not stand for justice." The studio gave a polite round of applause, as if the audience had already decided to trust the one who spoke fluently over the one who stood alone with a sign. A new resident, interviewed right after her segment, asked bluntly, "Did Mr. Maris say anything?" The reporter shook his head. We reached out, but got no response. But that answer was not entirely true, because later that afternoon, Ellior did respond not in words, but in action. He returned to the plot he had once been banned from. The injunction had been paused pending appeal, so he was now legally allowed back. Beneath the old pine trees, next to the boundary marker his father had placed, he raised a new wooden sign taller, sturdier, with deeper engraving. And beneath the line Parcel 191 Private Land, he painted one additional line in red: whoever builds on another's land will be ordered by law to tear it down with their own hands. The sentence was not long, not threatening, but it made the entire construction site pause for a moment when it was read. A woman walking her child past the model homes turned her head twice, her eyes settling on Ellior as he secured the sign, then tightened her grip on the child's hand. There were no reporters that day, but a young resident recorded Ellior placing the sign and uploaded it with the caption, "They would not let him speak." So he wrote. By morning, the video had over 30,000 shares, and beneath every share were hundreds of repeating questions all asking the same thing. If that really is his land, what happens to the 120 houses? No one answered, because none of the buyers from Lot 58 to Lot 83 knew they were placing deposits on land the true owner had never agreed to sell, had never been consulted about, and still held full legal documentation for. That question. If that land truly belongs to Ellior Maris, are the 120 house lots legally valid? Began surfacing even in the most confidential meetings of the HOA Oversight Board. And from there, the fake smiles began to tremble. Celia was still playing her game of strategy, but now she understood one thing clearly. With a single strike of a judge's gavel, everything they had built could become a concrete confession that they had crossed a legal line, one they could no longer deny. And when that happened, Ellior's wooden sign would need no more words. In the late afternoon, a 19-second clip appeared on a small YouTube channel named R. Keen Tech Survey Notes. The interface was plain, with no sensational title, only a note: April Survey Day, Bluffs Project. But the moment the video began, every word was clear. Celia Thorn, holding a laser pointer, stood before a projector screen in the HOA meeting room, pointing at a project land map, her eyes steady as the red boundary labeled Parcel 191 came into view. "Cross this part out," she said firmly. "We don't need to submit this section to the county. The file interface should only show the new markers. If anyone asks, say it's vacant, undetermined land." Seconds later, the screen went black. No music, no editing. The uploader was Rowan Keene, the engineer in charge of surveying for Phase 2 of the Heritage Bluffs project, known for being quiet, avoiding industry forums, and keeping a distance from internal construction engineering circles. But that clip was a spark in every sense. In less than 12 hours, the video passed 10,000 views, with thousands of comments. They knew, deliberately hiding the boundary, direct evidence. The hashtag #WrongLand spread rapidly beneath every repost. A day later, Rowan received an email from the HOA office with the subject line: Notice of confidentiality breach. Action required. The message got straight to the point. You have violated company confidentiality by publicly sharing internal material. If the video is not removed within 12 hours, the HOA will file a lawsuit and ban you from accessing any properties under its authority. Rowan sat still. He reopened his collaboration contract, scanned every line, and saw the clause prohibiting disclosure of unpublished project data. But he also knew no clause could legalize erasing land boundaries and presenting the altered map to officials as if the original never existed. Rowan replied with a short email: I did not breach confidentiality. I am reporting the alteration of maps to justify construction on land not owned by the HOA. If you consider that a secret, then the secret is that you are building on someone else's land. He did not wait for a reply. Instead, he uploaded another clip from a different meeting between senior members, where Celia said, Parcel 191 is just forgotten land. No title. No one spoke up for decades. If someone finds out now, it's too late to reverse. Her tone was calm, almost mocking. Within 48 hours, the two videos had been shared more than 80,000 times. Independent legal groups began reviewing the case, citing regulations on knowingly altering planning records to bypass permitting authorities. The original maps from 1985, the same ones Ellior had filed in court, were now being compared openly by online communities. Many people began to realize that the homes they had just placed deposits on might be sitting on land that had never been legally transferred. Every video repost carried the same bold red hashtags: number wrong land, number fake map, number Elior was right. Throughout that entire period, Elior remained silent. He did not share, did not comment, and did not appear on any forum. When a reporter attempted to reach him, he said only one sentence: "I'm not chasing views. I submit evidence directly to the court," and that is exactly what he did. On the third day after the clip went public, he personally delivered a copy of the video, along with a written statement, to the North Creek Civil Court. The folder's cover bore a single line: "This is their own recorded testimony." The court accepted it immediately. The video had not been edited, showed no signs of tampering, and was recorded by a team member directly involved in the project, making the statement part of admissible evidence. A preliminary judge issued an emergency request to the State Office of Planning and Construction, recommending the suspension of any final construction certificates for homes located on land officially listed as under legal dispute. At the same time, Rowan began receiving anonymous messages. Some were mild warnings: "Knowing too much isn't good for you." Others were harsher: "Engineers should focus on measurements, not tripwires." He said nothing publicly, but forwarded every message to his legal counsel. And in a private interview with the local PBS affiliate, when asked why he released the footage, he simply said, "I'm not helping anyone. I just won't be part of erasing boundaries on land or on principle." Rowan's action opened a door Celia had not anticipated. The issue was no longer between Elior and the HOA. It had become a matter of public interest, a question for everyone who had ever believed that the law could be bent by a redrawn map. And those who had once mocked the wooden sign Elior planted the year before were now returning to read the line carved into its base: "Whoever builds on another's land will be ordered by law to tear it down with their own hands." Because maybe, after everything, each brick they laid was not just building a home, it was building a responsibility that could no longer be walked away from. On Tuesday afternoon, a tweet from the account @BeckelLC began spreading rapidly with the opening line: "I put down a deposit for Lot 70, 7 at Heritage Bluffs, and now I just found out that house was built on land that was never officially registered." Attached to the post was a screenshot of a transaction email, a map of the construction site, and a short caption: "Parcel 191, disputed property, overlay zone." Within hours, the post had gained over 70,000 likes, 8,000 comments, and hundreds of questions flooding in beneath it. Did they really sell land they don't own? Anyone else living in this area? Any lawyer taking this case? Becca Louise Carter, a 32-year-old marketing professional living in South Winds, a neighboring state, had placed the deposit on Lot 77 2 months earlier after touring the model homes with her mother. Everything had seemed smooth at first. The sales staff told her clearly, "This area is fully zoned, the land is safe, and occupancy certificates will be issued next quarter." No one mentioned the name Elior Maris, nor said a word about the ongoing dispute over the land known as Parcel 191. In fact, Lot 77 had been highlighted in brochures as a prime corner unit, wide frontage, clearly defined boundary. But now Becca realized that the boundary wasn't so clear. It had been ignored, redrawn, and then sold as if everything had already been decided. She emailed the HOA's sales department: "I request to cancel the transaction and receive a full refund of the $35,000 deposit for Lot 77, as the seller failed to disclose the ongoing legal dispute concerning the land." 2 days later, she received a reply but not an apology. It was a stamped legal notice that read, "Ms. Becca Carter has publicly defamed the Heritage Bluffs project and harmed the commercial reputation of the HOA. If the post is not removed within 24 hours, we will consider legal action for reputational damage." Becca read the letter 3 times, in disbelief. All she had done was point out a fact. She had put money down on a house that could be ordered for demolition, and now she was being threatened with a lawsuit for defamation. The next morning, she went to find Elior Maris. Not through the press, not through attorneys, she walked straight to the wooden fence where the private land Parcel 191 sign still stood. Elior was resecuring a boundary stake. A stranger approaching didn't surprise him. She introduced herself and didn't hide the fact that she had placed a deposit. "I'm not here to fight you, but I feel like I signed up for something I never agreed to." Elior listened, then pointed into the distance, where beige-colored houses were nearing completion. "I'm not trying to tear down anyone's home. I just want the boundary to be respected. They can build anywhere, just not on what I've protected for nearly 40 years. There was no political tone in his voice, no provocation, no call to action, But the words struck at the quiet fear growing inside Becca and inside thousands of others just like her. That evening, she posted again on Twitter. "I just met Elier Maris. He's not fighting for money. He simply said, 'I'm not trying to tear down anyone's home. I just want the boundary to be respected.' I believe him." And I think it's time we start asking who really moved the line. The tweet instantly became the most discussed topic in the local community. In less than 8 hours, it gained more than 200,000 interactions and was reshared by major accounts in real estate, civil law, and first-time homebuyer groups. The most liked comment under the post summed it up in one line: "One man is defending the boundary, while a system tries to redraw it." The next morning, a spontaneous group of residents registered for a face-to-face meeting with representatives from the HOA office. They brought no banners, chanted no slogans, only comparison maps, legal questions, and a direct request. "We want to know which boundary documents were used to approve this entire development, and if there is legal risk, who will be held accountable if our homes are ordered to be torn down?" Celia Thorn did not answer immediately. She requested that all questions be paused and then did not appear at the HOA office for the next 3 days. But the homebuyers did not wait. They filed letters with the local newspaper, brought in lawyers to review the contracts, and discovered that 14 homes sat directly on the Parcel 191 boundary, including Becca's Lot 77. What stood out was this. In the original drawing submitted to the county, that land had been crossed out in the video captured by Rowan but was quietly reinserted later in a supplemental version of the file. Elier did not respond publicly, but he updated a single line on his wooden sign, just beneath the original message. "I'm not pushing anyone out of their home. I'm just not letting them push the boundary into mine." That was the final statement, and the beginning of a new wave of scrutiny. Because now, it was no longer just about who was right or wrong, it was about a deeper question. If you buy a home, are you sure where its boundary lies? Or will you only find out when the ground beneath you shifts a few inches, and someone calls it zoning? On an April morning, the Records Office of West Layton County received a request to verify the signatures on a 2003 land transfer file related to the property marked Parcel 191. The request came from a representative of a group of residents who had hired private legal counsel after the case involving Elier Maris gained attention. They wanted to re-examine the HOA office's claim that the land boundary had been legally transferred in the early 2000s. That same day, the results came back. The signature on the document, allegedly belonging to Elier's father, Lionel Maris, did not match any archived signature samples from previous transactions. A veteran notary, Mr. Raymond Bexley, who had personally certified documents for the Maris family, confirmed, "There is no notarized file in my record with that wording. And if the signer was Mr. Maris, he signed very differently for over 20 years. Oh. Meanwhile, in a separate effort, a team of civil surveyors hired by residents released an independent report on the land included in the HOA's development plans. The publicly posted conclusion stated, "The current technical map of the Heritage Bluffs project lacks verification from any federal agency, despite legal requirements that any development over historically disputed land must be federally reviewed before construction begins." This meant that the entire construction process could be deemed unlawful if someone filed a proper legal complaint under the correct provision. When Celia Thorn received copies of both reports, she did not call an attorney. Instead, she held a closed-door meeting with 5 senior members of the HOA's executive board, in a soundproofed room with the curtains drawn and phones face down. The first to speak was the vice president. "If the map has no federal clearance, we need to halt construction." But Celia cut him off. "If we stop now, we're admitting fault, and admitting fault gives that man a straight path to the press." Another member hesitated. "He still hasn't gone to major media. There might still be room to negotiate." Celia clenched her jaw and said slowly, "We have to stop him, before he stops this whole development from taking another step." But just as they were discussing how to stop Elier, it was already beyond their control. A local news page called Civic Scan published an article titled, "Drone Reveals Homes Built on Disputed Land, HOA May Face Investigation." The article included high-angle photos showing dozens of house foundations overlapping a red-drawn boundary, some built nearly 12 meters into the section confirmed to be owned by Elier Maris. The images were taken by a resident named Gabriel, who flew a personal drone along the western edge of the construction zone. A former terrain technician turned freelancer, Gabriel had not intended to make headlines. He uploaded the photos simply to wonder why things were so far off the map. The images became the first undeniable visual evidence. They showed that the encroachment was no longer on paper, but had become concrete, steel, and foundations weighing tons. Elior did not submit the article anywhere, but when asked, he repeated one thing. I said from the start they can't redraw a boundary with words. Every real boundary lives beneath the soil, and anyone who builds wrong will eventually have to face it. While Celia kept trying to contain the situation by denying everything and ordering posts removed from social media groups, the information spread through another channel: insurance companies. A construction insurance firm issued an internal warning. The Heritage Bluffs project involves a serious land dispute. Financial institutions are advised to exercise caution in continuing disbursements. Soon after, a local bank suspended loan approvals for 7 homebuyers in the area, citing uncertain legal status of the properties. The system Celia once described as solid as concrete was beginning to show cracks, but instead of addressing the cause, she tried to silence the source. One day later, Mr. Raymond, the notary who confirmed the forged signature, received an email from a law firm threatening legal action for baseless claims damaging local transactional credibility. He smiled and typed 3 lines in reply. I retain full backup copies. If necessary, I will testify before any court. The warning had turned around, and Celia knew what lay ahead was no longer a private dispute with Elior, but a chain reaction beyond the control of any HOA. And in the midst of it all, the man named Elior Maris still did not appear on television, did not livestream, did not start a fundraiser. He simply revised a few lines on the wooden sign at the boundary, replacing the old sentence with a new one. Paperwork can be forged, but land does not lie. In the fading light of day, the words cast a long shadow across rows of bricks, still drying, and made it clear that this fight was never about noise. It was about the one thing that cannot be bought, the truth buried in the ground. The preliminary hearing for West Layton County was held in a small government conference room, with 6 people seated at the front and more than 10 attendees in the gallery. Elior entered on time, holding a neatly organized file, placing it on the table like a quiet declaration. Across from him, Celia wore dark clothing, carried no documents, and scanned the room as if checking the positions of potential allies. An older supervisor sat in the center, hands clasped, looking toward the HOA representative. Miss Celia Thorn, according to the record, your office has affirmed that all submitted planning maps were legitimate. Celia nodded, her gaze fixed on Elior. The supervisor continued, slower this time. Then can you confirm that the development map for Heritage Bluffs, including the portion intersecting with Parcel 191, bears either state or federal certification? Celia's wrist tensed slightly before she replied, that material is part of our internal safety file and is not for public release. The supervisor leaned forward slightly, frowning. I'm not asking where it is. I'm asking who submitted it. For the next 3 seconds, the room fell into an unusual silence. No one spoke. Celia glanced at her attorney, but he remained focused on his phone. The pause was long enough for everyone to realize they had no answer. Elior lifted his file and handed it to the board. This is the original 1985 map, federally certified, updated in 1994, and supplemented under technical directive in 1999. He stated each date clearly, laying each sheet in front of the moderator. In all of these maps, Parcel 191 was never subdivided, never documented as transferred, and remains completely separate from any development parcels after the year 2000. One board member asked quietly, do you have a comparison overlay? Elior nodded, pulled out a large format scan, and spread it open. On it, the boundary layers were marked in distinct colors, with Parcel 191 overlapping the area currently under foundation work. The red line cut directly across house lots numbered 76 through 84. No one said a word, but the board members' expressions began to shift, tracing each inked line like following the trail of a lie left unchallenged for too long. An aide rushed in and whispered something to the lead supervisor. He paused, checked his phone, then looked up. We have just received a request to postpone the hearing from the HOA's legal office. They cite the need to verify the authenticity of opposing evidence. Elior said nothing, only nodded slightly, as if he had expected it. The supervisor exhaled and announced, this hearing is adjourned. We will reconvene once all documentation is reviewed and the respondent provides a complete file. Parcel 191 will be placed under provisional restriction, and all construction activities shall be halted until a court decision is issued. That statement was entered into the official record and signed by all 3 board members and attending witnesses. As he left the room, Elliot walked past Celia without looking at her, but her voice came from behind him. "Don't think you've won." He stopped, didn't turn back, and spoke slowly. "I never thought I won. I just think, this time, they won't get to build on a lie." Then he kept walking, leaving behind a room filled with papers fluttering in the air-conditioning breeze, and a woman beginning to realize this game was no longer in her hands. Elliot didn't leave his seat. When the supervisor announced the suspension, he calmly opened his leather case, pulled out a small ash-gray hard drive, and placed it on the table in front of the county attorney with a short sentence. This contains internal footage from their surveyor, who recorded the entire exchange where parcel 191 was deleted. I've also scanned the original measurements from the archived administrative maps at the regional planning office, including the sublayer of hydrology beneath the site. A simple gesture, but the room froze completely. The county attorney stopped writing, leaned over to unlock his tablet, and motioned for an aide to retrieve the drive. Moments later he spoke. "We are required to suspend all preliminary processing and convene an independent regional investigative committee. This is priority-grade evidence. The Heritage Bluffs project, effective immediately, is placed under full moratorium, including all planning, permitting, and transactions." Celia stood frozen, lips twitching slightly but trying to maintain a blank expression. The remaining HOA representatives lowered their heads, some pushing chairs back, others whispering into phones, none offering objection. Outside the chamber, Elliot stood at the steps in front of the courthouse, late sunlight slanting across the old stone walkway, quietly watching the stream of cars in the distance. He didn't need a press release, didn't need to declare victory or defeat. But in that moment, a notification flashed on his phone from the local news app. Karen built 120 homes on the wrong land. Viral story hits top 3 TikTok trends nationwide. Someone had edited the internal surveyor video, the exact part where Celia crosses out the map and says, "Take this section out," and overlaid it with footage of the private land, parcel 191 sign, and the board's unanswered questions. Within 4 hours, the hashtag number wrongland surpassed 2 million views, and the caption, "You just built $1 million mistake," became the most quoted phrase of the week. Elliot didn't share the post, didn't hit like. He simply saved the original footage and sent an additional copy to the regional court's email with the note, "This is their own recording, I changed nothing." That night, the HOA office was temporarily sealed under an order to preserve evidence. Internal emails were frozen, and servers were locked under the supervision of the State Justice Department. Those who once sat at the table approving the development plans now had to account for every revision they made, every document they signed, every map they submitted, and quietly pulled back. Meanwhile, Elliot returned to the small house at the end of the road, where he had lived for the past 17 years. The wooden porch faded, the old crack on the south wall still unpatched. But he looked out over the patch of land in front of the yard, the one his father once marked in red ink. "Keep this, don't let anyone touch it. This is the water vein." And he knew, today, he had kept that exact promise, not just through documents, but through a kind of resolve no instrument could ever measure. At an emergency forum convened by the district's financial council, a real estate attorney named Malcolm Reyes was invited to present. Under the pale white lights of the hall, he stood and spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough that even the last row could hear every word. The Heritage Bluffs project uses maps, lacking federal certification. This constitutes a direct violation of Clause 5 Ampere under the Geospatial Transaction Protection Act, meaning every purchase contract based on that map may be declared legally void. A chill swept through the room like wind down an unfinished hallway. People who believed they already owned homes now looked at each other as if an earthquake had begun under the tile floors they had yet to step on. A man rose, face still blank with disbelief. "I'm the buyer of lot 65. I took a loan to place my deposit. If the contract's invalid, does that mean I just paid for a house that doesn't legally exist?" Murmurs rose from the back row. Another voice followed. "I bought through a broker. They swore everything was approved." A young woman clenched the leather handle of her briefcase, fingers digging into the zipper. "The bank already approved my mortgage. If this deal collapses, my credit score goes with it." No one cried, but the silence felt like wet cement sealing over a cracked foundation. Everyone understood they might have just signed the verdict on their own dreams. Celia stepped up to the podium, holding a color-printed internal file. "We have boundary confirmations from the HOA's internal records, sufficient to continue legal proceedings. These contracts remain valid under the project's internal compliance framework. She spoke like someone clinging to an elevator cable mid-fall, but as she finished, Malcolm quietly shook his head, lifting a thick photocopy packet. This is the certification trace from the state notary office. There is not a single federal stamp on the original file. And under Clause 8.3 of the Real Property Transactions Act, any document lacking federal validation cannot be used to zone new land or support property sales. Internal copies? Sorry, the law doesn't accept paperwork even if the original signers won't bring it into daylight. The soft tap of a pen from the banking representatives cut through the room like fog thickening. One voice whispered, "We might be facing a chain credit collapse." Ellior stood at the back, quietly watching as expressions fell across each other like dominoes. He didn't smile, didn't speak, but his gaze, as clear as the morning he first replanted the private land sign, now burned brighter than ever. A nearby resident turned and asked softly, "Do you want them to tear the houses down?" He replied, "I don't want anything. I just don't want people to ignore boundaries that were always there." That line would later be quoted in a column titled, "The line was always there, they just didn't want to see it." On the phone screen of an attendee, a legal forum alert popped up. Risk warning. Heritage Bluffs project is under review for permanent suspension due to mapping violations. All transactions must be re-examined within 72 hours. The message was brief and emotionless, but to many in the room, it marked the end of a dream they had signed, borrowed, and planned to live out for the rest of their lives. Celia stood frozen, eyes still locked on the screen, her hands now limp, as if she finally understood. No matter how big a contract is, if it's built on a small lie, it will eventually collapse under the very detail they once thought too minor to read out loud. In the thick air of unease filling the room, Ellior didn't need to raise his voice. He simply turned to the last page of a sample contract a resident had brought, then pointed to a small line printed in font size 6, faint and thin. All legal liability rests with the seller if the property falls outside of lawful ownership. It was a line most people overlooked when signing, but now it cut through every previous argument like a silent blade. A young attorney nearby read it twice, then quietly closed the folder. A woman behind them murmured, "So, if the boundary's wrong, they're fully liable?" Ellior nodded. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. Every answer was already written in the paperwork people thought would protect them. Across the current of social media, a clip pulled from the internal broadcast of the hearing began to spread. In it, Ellior, still in his plain dark shirt, stood before the same crowd that once doubted him, turned the contract page, and pointed to the clause, saying, "I'm not here to win. I'm here to remind you that the law isn't something to bargain with. It's meant to protect both me and all of you." The statement was shared over 60,000 times that same afternoon. An anonymous account reposted it with the caption, "The man they call difficult turns out to be the kindest one here." And strangely, no one objected. Not a single critical comment appeared under the post. One person added, "I used to think he was just after money. Now I see, he's the only one left protecting the dignity of this entire neighborhood." That comment was pinned to the top, a signal that this exhausted community, worn down by confusion and hollow reassurances, had finally found its moral compass amid a legal maze collapsing piece by piece. While Celia shut her office doors, avoided the press, and ignored every resident inquiry, Ellior continued walking past the land's boundary each evening, stopping under the oak tree beside the private land sign he had restored from the first week. No explanations, no rebuttals. It was his quiet and unwavering presence that made people start believing again. Because while a system tried to repaint, conceal, and redraw the lines, there was one person who chose, from the very start, to hold on to what was right. A group of residents came to see Ellior after the meeting. The man who had once questioned him the harshest was the first to speak. "I used to think you were stubborn, but now I realize, if it weren't for someone like you, we might have ended up paying for something that doesn't exist." Ellior shook their hands without saying much, and only replied, "I kept the land because my father asked me to, but now I keep it because I don't want anyone else to pay the price for silence." In that moment, a woman standing nearby took out her phone and captured the scene. The photo had no logo, no caption, just the moment of a man standing among a crowd that once turned their backs on him, now looking at him as if he were the last steady ground beneath a crumbling stack of contracts. That same day, inside the county boardroom, a legal officer glanced at the thick project file and quietly said to a colleague nearby, "The scary thing isn't Ellior, it's that we didn't listen to him sooner." The announcement from the county office was released on a midweek morning, just a 3-page PDF posted on a public website, yet it sent shockwaves through every neighborhood group and legal forum. The headline was cold, unembellished, not bolded or sensational. Preliminary indictment of Miss Celia Thorn and 2 HOA members in connection with charges of falsifying public documents and unauthorized construction on private property. But every sentence inside struck directly at the foundation of the project, they once touted as a model of sustainable development. In objective, precise language, the file listed each instance Celia signed off on maps lacking federal certification, every meeting where Parcel 191 was deliberately omitted from presentation materials, and every internal email instructing surveyors to ignore that area. The phrase, evidence of fraudulent intent, appeared 3 times, along with a note from the inspector. Intent can be established from the video submitted by engineer Rowan and the notary's testimony regarding signature discrepancies on the deed transfer. The final line was blunt. File referred to county court for preliminary investigation under Section 304, Clause C of the Building and Property Code. As the news spread, press crews swarmed the HOA office building at the end of the block. A local reporter captured Celia leaving her private attorney's office. Gone were the high heels and pencil skirts from her first press appearance. She wore a heavy coat, head lowered, hand covering her face as she walked to her car. A young reporter rushed forward. "Do you have any comment on the allegations of document fraud?" Celia didn't respond. The hand that once pointed directly at Elior in front of the county board was now tucked into her pocket. As the car door closed, her face flashed briefly behind the tinted glass, pale, drained, barely resembling the woman who once stood in the middle of the construction site declaring, "This land is zoned. No one can stop us." Elsewhere that same morning, Elior sat in his small home office, facing a freshly printed copy of the indictment notice, still warm with the scent of ink. He didn't show any particular reaction, just tapped his pen against the desk edge a few times before standing, taking a marker and highlighting 2 items: falsification of public records and violation of property rights. Those words had been in the letters he sent out from the very first month, but only now had the system responded with an official act. He filed the page alongside the rest of the dispute documents, placing it neatly next to his father's original map, the one mocked for months as worthless. Outside, the construction site had not come to a complete halt. Some machines still roared in adjacent areas outside the disputed boundary. But Parcel 191 was now cordoned off with red warning tape and a sign that read, "Under federal investigation. Do not enter without a court order." Those who once worked there quietly left, leaving behind unfinished foundations, partially dried concrete, and an empty space like a forgotten void in a neighborhood that had just been reminded of the truth. In a private group for homebuyers, one member wrote, "They used to call him a troublemaker. Now I think he might be the only one who knew what he was protecting." Another replied, "This story isn't about land anymore. It's about who dares to speak up when everyone else chooses silence." And somewhere, Elior knew justice wouldn't end with a 3-page indictment. But at least, it had started where it needed to begin, the truth. A long-form article over 1,000 words was shared on the homepage of the state's largest newspaper. It began with a photo of the private land, Parcel 191 sign, standing upright on the bare plot. This time it wasn't the rough wooden board from before, but a laser-etched steel plaque with sharp edges, anchored deep into freshly poured concrete. Below it, the weeds had been cleared, replaced by a stripped, flat surface. To the left of the sign stood a stone pillar marked with GPS coordinates. To the right, a smaller sign containing the case file code currently under investigation. The newspaper's caption read, "This is the evidence they didn't want you to see." The article spread quickly, not only for its airtight legal breakdown, but for its cold, cutting tone. While many asked how one individual could defeat an entire system, the answer might lie in the very sign they once mocked as a rotten board stuck in the ground. Below the piece, thousands of comments poured in. Many who had followed the case since week 1 left notes like, "Now we know who actually knew where they were standing." Ibra. Around the same time, a television journalist released a leaked audio recording from a past internal conversation among HOA members, provided by someone identifying themselves as a former member who resigned before things went too far. In the recording, a woman's voice, believed to be Celia's, stated clearly, "If this blows up, just blame the techs. Say they submitted the wrong map. Call it a clerical mistake." The source confirmed, "She told us straight up, whoever holds the ruler takes the fall. Our job is just to sign." The voice carried no bitterness, just fatigue. I sat at that table. I watched every nod of agreement when she gave the order. But no one spoke up. Everyone was afraid of being labeled the one who broke the unity. After the audio went public, Celia's legal team declined to comment. Meanwhile, ethics oversight bodies began opening their own files to investigate misdirection and personal denial of responsibility within the civil organization. In the area of Parcel 191, once the center of the dispute, the silence now feels almost tangible. There are no more drilling sounds, no more concrete trucks, only a few remaining barricades left like remnants. A group of law students came to photograph the newly erected sign, using it as a case study for their course, Land Ownership Conflicts and Legal Evidence. An old professor stood beside them, pointing at the inscription. This sign is the silent declaration of a citizen who didn't need to shout, yet still brought the entire system to a halt. The woman next to him nodded quietly. It stands there like a boundary marker for something people always try to deny, that truth can't be moved if it's been measured by justice. And somewhere on the outskirts, Elier continued to show up on time at hearings, still bringing the old map and photocopied files from his father, still speaking with the same calm but firm tone. He didn't call for protests, didn't respond with angry words, only repeated one thing. I don't need to win arguments. I just need them to look at the foundation they're standing on and ask themselves, are they sure they're not standing on someone else's land? That steadiness, combined with the steel sign, turned the case from a minor property dispute into a lasting lesson about the meaning of boundaries, not just of land, but of character. And from here, the larger question began to take shape. How will the system make things right when it once chose to ignore a piece of land clearly marked since 1985? An anonymous account sent a hard drive to the local news office, containing files believed to be extracted from the HOA's internal server, labeled with the codename 191R data. Inside were dozens of emails and message exchanges between Celia and the construction contractors, along with legal and technical personnel of the project. One email, verified to be sent from Celia's official account, carried the subject line, "Proceed as planned," with the body stating, "Keep going. That black guy won't sue. He's just making noise for a payout." The short, chilling sentence sent shockwaves through the entire community following the case. A reporter commented, "This is no longer about a technical oversight. This is willful lawbreaking coupled with blatant racial discrimination." It didn't stop there. In a folder named Blueprint Revisions, one file contained the edit history of the technical maps. A message exchange between two HOA personnel read, "File coordinates altered. Make sure the original boundary doesn't show." The message was sent 3 months before Elier posted his warning sign, meaning the entire falsification process was planned and executed deliberately. Notably, the original map editor was a former engineer who had been fired, but who later began cooperating with the district attorney after seeing the internal surveyor video Elier had released. He testified, "I was ordered to change the parameters without explanation. All versions were locked with top-tier access. Only Celia and her advisory group could open them." These pieces of evidence were swiftly added to the investigation file. The legal team representing homebuyers petitioned to expand the scope of the case, shifting from falsification of public records to organized fraud and racial bias in the management of a public-facing project. A representative of the resident group stated, "We didn't just buy houses. We believe the project was transparently managed. But now we realize we were victims of a system rigged from the start." Social media exploded with posts attaching screenshots of the internal emails, where Celia referred to Elier as "that guy," "the sign jumper," and "the rotted old map." A senior attorney posted, just one sentence, "They could fake the map, not the truth." In the law office handling the lawsuit, the lights stayed on late into the night. New pieces of evidence were printed and pinned to a corkboard, connected with red string, numbered, and time-stamped. At the center of the tangled legal diagram was a printout of the former technician's statement. "I altered the map to delete boundary 191 under direct orders." From this point, the matter no longer remained a property dispute. It had officially entered the darker territory of systemic manipulation. And the person who once denied all involvement now appeared repeatedly across every thread of communication. No one could ignore the looming question anymore. If they erased boundaries on the map, how many more boundaries had they crossed in running their organization? Elier entered the federal building with a neatly organized file. The original 1,000 985 map with federal authentication, a video copy from the internal surveyor, leaked internal emails, and the notary's sworn statement, all sectioned, labeled, and ordered. He placed them on the table without saying anything. The intake attorney skimmed the cover page, flipped through a few red-marked documents, his expression shifting from professional caution to focused silence. Finally, he said, "If what you're presenting holds up, this isn't administrative misconduct. This is a coordinated effort to deceive both county and state agencies. If the investigation confirms it, those involved won't just lose their positions, they'll lose the right to manage any residential community going forward." Ellior nodded, showing no sign of satisfaction. Through this entire journey, he hadn't sought victory. The only thing he wanted was for the boundary both of land and ethics to be restored. As Ellior left the building, a reporter across the street called out, "Do you believe they'll be prosecuted?" He stopped and replied calmly, "I don't bet on the law. I bet on the truth." That quote, captured and shared, quickly became a viral soundbite, paired with a tweet that had exploded that morning. It wasn't Ellior suing a system, it was a system choking on its own arrogance. The caption appeared alongside an image of the steel sign, "Private Land, Parcel 191, sunlight slanting across it, casting a long shadow on the unfinished ground, now officially re-established." The post came from a homebuyer who had once stayed silent out of fear of financial loss, now publicly standing with Ellior, like hundreds of others. Public sentiment was no longer split. The debate had shifted from who was right to how deep the wrongs went, when they began, and who had been behind them. In an emergency city council meeting, legal advisors debated launching a civil investigation in parallel with criminal prosecution, citing the case's complexity and public impact. One council member asked aloud, "If those houses are ruled illegal, who's responsible for tearing them down and paying restitution?" No answer came immediately, but no one referred to Ellior as a threat anymore. He had gone from being labeled a disruption to becoming the one who supplied the original map that the entire system was now using to revalidate itself. He wasn't the cause of the chaos, he was the reset button. In another corner of the city, inside a small coffee shop, a group of law students was debating the lawsuit as a living case study. One student said, "Celia didn't lose because she didn't know the law. She lost because she believed she had the right to redraw boundaries, both on the map and in behavior." Another added, "And because she underestimated the man." Ellior never raised a slogan, never called anyone to action, but his persistence and quiet presence forced everyone to confront what the system had long tried to ignore. Boundaries are not something you get to redraw at will, whether with red ink or unchecked power. Among the thousands of shares online, the hashtags number respect boundaries and number parcel 191 stood out as a reminder that some lines, once crossed, don't just cost a project, they cost legitimacy. And sometimes, it all starts with one engineer putting back a sign everyone thought meant nothing. A closed courtroom, ceiling lights bright, not a whisper as the judge flipped through the file and read aloud each point of dispute. On the plaintiff's side sat Ellior's legal team, tidy, quiet, but meticulously prepared with evidence. On the defense side was Celia Thorn, dressed in a pale gray suit, her gaze no longer as firm as in previous press conferences, now tinged with hesitation. The judge, a middle-aged woman, spoke calmly but with unmistakable sharpness in each question. "Miss Celia," she said, eyes fixed on the woman standing at the witness stand, "did you ever receive any warning that the land under development was within a legally disputed boundary?" Celia glanced briefly at her attorney, her throat catching against the mic. "I don't clearly remember," she said, voice lowering as if unsure whether the answer came from truth or self-preservation. From the plaintiff's table, Ellior stood at the signal. He carried an old file bag, opened it, and pulled out the map his father had used for 30 years as a regional land surveyor. Without dramatic preamble, he held the map up to the courtroom light. The paper had yellowed, but the red ink remained bold, a firm boundary line marking parcel 191, with a handwritten note on the back. "Preserve the boundary. Don't let silence blur the law." Ellior presented it to the judge, his hands steady. "This is the first piece of evidence I'm submitting. The warning didn't just come in words, it came through the actions taken to conceal it," he said, then stepped back. His attorney submitted matching records, date of receipt of the map, date the project filed its paperwork, and the internal video timestamp showing Celia striking out the parcel 191 line. Every timeline is aligned within a week. The bench fell silent. Then one panel member flipped a page. "The planning submission to the county, lacks all federal coordinate verification appendices. That sentence sliced the air. It was no longer a question of personal error. The entire HOA now faced the question: did they knowingly build a 120-home project on disputed land without disclosing it, or were they truly unaware? All the evidence pointed one way, that they knew, and deliberately ignored it. Celia lowered her head, her shoulders no longer held with the pride she once displayed. One of her attorneys whispered in her ear, but she didn't respond. Some might call it exhaustion, others a realization that what they once considered empty land, something okay to push a little, had become the center of a redefinition of both legal and power boundaries. A local paper updated its headline right after that morning's session. The judge's question, who among them knew and chose to proceed anyway, may be either the key to resolution or the verdict that brings the entire system down. Amid the upheaval, only one thing remained unchanged. Ellior wasn't after victory or defeat. He simply turned over each piece of the truth, refusing to let anyone excuse their actions with, "I don't clearly remember," because those who forget boundaries will eventually be pulled back to the line they once stepped across. And this time, the court stood in front, while behind him was a community no longer silent. Celia remained standing in the courtroom, no longer able to maintain composure, both hands clenched since the moment Ellior held up the map before the court. Between the judge's gaze and the sound of paper flipping from the clerk's desk, her eyes landed on a simple image. No one from the HOA board wanted to see the private land, Parcel 191 steel sign, the image that had spread across social media and now sat displayed as part of the official record. She was no longer smirking like at press conferences, no longer speaking with the confidence she once showed at voter town halls. Her hands trembled slightly before closing into fists, and for a moment, her entire body seemed frozen by a truth that, no matter how long denied, could not erase the red ink on the original map or the handwritten note from a father to his son about boundaries. The lawyer next to her, once the strongest voice defending the HOA, now bowed his head, offering no rebuttal, no request for delay, only silence like the rest who had once signed off on the fabricated planning files. The judge looked at them for several long seconds, like delivering a sentence without speaking. She tapped her gavel lightly, her voice steady and firm. The Heritage Bluffs project is hereby ordered to cease all transactions, remove all sale advertisements, and await legal boundary assessment and verification for the entirety of the contested lots. No objections were raised. The ruling was temporary, but it landed like a blow that halted the flow of both money and arrogance. Those who had once voted in favor of the project now looked at one another, shoulders sagging, hands wringing at their sleeves. The pens that had signed the contracts were now evidence. The glowing price boards that once praised the project would have to be taken down. A neighborhood that had not yet risen was already collapsing at the roots, not because of settling concrete, but because every brick had been placed in the wrong spot on the map and in the conscience of those who drew it. Ellior stepped out of the courthouse, made no statement, and didn't glance at Celia. He waited on the front steps, looking across at the park, where a few children rode bikes around a circle of red dirt. Reporters closed in, but he simply shook his head and said one short sentence: "No one should live on a lie." Then he turned away, still holding the old map, his dusty shoes stepping down the stairs as if this battle had never been about bringing someone down, but about keeping one piece of land from being labeled with a name it never bore. The steel sign remained there, without guards, without a lock. Because now, the court's silence and the lawyer's bowed head had become the strongest fence around what belonged to Ellior, not because he shouted, but because he stood firm until they were forced to stop. And for the first time since that sign was placed, no one asked who he was. They only asked, how did we let the truth stay buried for so long? The news aired in the late afternoon, the anchor's face appearing beside the caption, "The first apology from within the HOA." In the short clip, a new member, formerly just an observer, spoke publicly for the first time on camera. His voice wasn't polished, his gaze didn't try to appear strong, but he nodded slightly and said one simple sentence: "We were wrong, not because we built on the wrong land, but because we believed in authority instead of believing in boundaries." The station didn't replay it, didn't add effects, just let the moment sit like a public bow in broad daylight. After that came a silent studio, then the anchor's voice. "This is the first time, and hopefully not the last." From that apology, other doors began to open, not through court rulings, but through a shift in tone. A group of previously neutral residents, mostly early-phase homebuyers, organized a community gathering. No talk of lawsuits, no focus on blame, just a table set up under the oak tree, At the center of the land, the original survey point from Ellier's map, and on it, the private land, parcel 191 sign, now cleaned, removed from the site, and engraved with a new line. This is proof that no boundary stands firmer than the truth. Everyone who passed stopped for a moment. Some signed a petition to preserve the sign as a legal landmark, not for condemnation, but to teach future generations about the cost of overreach. An elderly man in a white shirt signed with a shaking hand, then turned to Elior, standing quietly nearby, and said, "When I was young, I thought the law was how people win. Now I see it only matters when it's not used to beat each other." Elior replied with a small nod, saying nothing, in the same way he had handled this entire journey, not pushing anyone out, just pulling everything back into place. The petition event lasted 3 days, and by the afternoon of the third, the sign had nearly 1,000 signatures, not from one side, but from people of every background, class, and age. A young mother brought her child, saying, "I used to be afraid of you, because the media said so, but when I saw you refuse to take the sign down, and even refuse a payout, I started to ask questions." The child tugged on her hand and asked, "Who is he?" Elior knelt and touched the sign gently. "I'm just someone who knows where he's standing." From that gathering, local high schools began incorporating the case into civics lessons. One teacher brought her students to the land, pointed at the sign, and said, "The law isn't wrong, but the way we use it can be, and that's why we have to learn." Meanwhile, the new HOA board voted unanimously to remove all foundations that had encroached on Ellier's land, to reinspect 27 unoccupied homes, and to cancel all active contracts on plots within parcel 191. They issued a statement. "We choose to step back, not because we lost the case, but because we realize that stubbornness is the fastest way to lose an entire community." Celia did not appear, did not respond, but in a photo that circulated a few days later, she sat alone in her backyard, looking toward the steel sign that had been reinstalled this time with no one taking it down, and no one calling it a nuisance. What was once seen as a thorn had now become a marker of transparency, and it all started with a nod that opened not just a string of doors, but a new chapter in how a community faces its mistakes. Ellior stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, hands in his coat pockets, eyes not on any camera, just watching people walk slowly past the reinstalled private land steel sign. When a young reporter approached with a microphone and asked if he had anything to say at the statewide investigation's conclusion announcement, he tilted his head slightly and answered with one short sentence. "Justice doesn't need applause. It just needs not to be bent." He finished and walked away, without pause, without turning back. The microphone stayed in the reporter's hand, but everything around fell silent for a few seconds, as if someone had pulled a tight string across the air. At that moment, someone nearby managed to capture a video. No edits, no cuts, just posted with one caption, "He didn't claim victory, he held the boundary." The clip spread within hours. A major account pinned the post, followed by tens of thousands of comments. One line stood out, shared over and over. "He didn't need to win, because he kept what they never had: integrity from the start." No banners were raised, no loudspeakers used, but every post, every article mentioning his name carried the same steady, quiet weight, like the way he had protected his father's land. Without shouting, without forcing anyone to take sides, simply holding firm to a boundary that couldn't be bargained. Meanwhile, the HOA seemed to retreat in silence. No press conferences, no rebuttals. Celia's old office was emptied, the nameplate removed, and weekly meetings were canceled without explanation. Residents in the area began revisiting old zoning plans, printing maps themselves, calling for a new board to be formed under one principle. All decisions must be public, must involve community input, and must be verified by sight, not just by signatures on fake documents. A group of law students reached out to Elior, asking if they could create a local legal education program around the case. He nodded, but declined to be named. "If you want to learn from the mistakes they made, not from me fixing them." That response was shared again, this time by a professor in the student group, captioned, "Someone who understands boundaries doesn't need to put their name on everything." In the days that followed, people noticed the private land sign had been fitted with a protective glass cover. No one ordered it, but that morning, as residents walked by, it shimmered in the sunlight clean, untouched by dust or scratches. Someone had left a small bouquet at its base, no card, no message. But everyone passing by understood it wasn't for mourning, but for acknowledgement. Not of loss, but of something that had been kept intact, honest, and in its rightful place. Those who once spoke out against him were now silent, not out of fear, but because there was nothing left to refute. And those who once avoided the topic now stepped forward, signed their names, brought their children to stand before the sign, and retold the story in a tone very different from what they had said just months ago. It wasn't a reversal, it was a process gradual, needing no command. And at its center stood a man who raised no slogans, asked for no applause, simply stood firm on the line and said, "I just need what's right, not to be bent." 1 week after the preliminary ruling, representatives from the State Inspector General's office officially arrived at the Heritage Bluffs area, carrying a warrant for a full audit of 8 projects previously overseen by Celia Thorn. No one in the neighborhood was unfamiliar with those names. All of them had once been praised for rapid development efficiency, flexible management, and streamlined paperwork. But this time, the very traits that once made the system seem flawless had become its greatest liabilities. Every set of documents, technical maps, and approval slips was ordered to be copied and compared to the original land records. On that list, the name Parcel 191 appeared as an official control reference. A lead engineer on the audit team stated, "We're using Mr. 7, Maris's map as the baseline because it's the only one with a federal stamp, never altered, and verified by 2 independent surveyors within the last 3 months." In other words, the land once dismissed as waste had now become the standard by which planning decisions across 3 neighboring counties would be reevaluated. An emergency technical council was formed to verify the entire legal framework of the region from 1980 to the present. Any project tied to Celia had its records sealed, and those who had signed off on maps were summoned to account for boundary coordinates and ownership rights. Some testified they were told to trust the updated version without reviewing the original. Others said they were just following administrative instructions from superiors. All pointed to a system where speed was prioritized over accuracy, where so-called flexibility was really just a way to ignore inconvenient boundary markers in expansion plans. But with one map that had remained unchanged for nearly 4 decades, the system collapsed without debate. It collapsed when no one could confirm where the true markers were, when every justification only made clearer who had allowed lines to be redrawn and basic technical standards to be bypassed. Elior's father's old map was brought out for public review, every red ink stroke, every hand-drawn symbol assessed under the oversight of the State Planning Council. A senior official observed, "Sometimes the most trustworthy document isn't the newest one, but the one that's never been edited to fit short-term interests." The handwritten note, "Never sell preserve the water vein," was read aloud during a statewide technical assembly. Then came a decision the map would be used to adjust federal planning in the state's Central Triangle, an area long disrupted by unchecked urban expansion over the past decade. Meanwhile, HOA offices were audited for internal procedures. An email from the State Executive Board was sent to all residential organizations. No individual or entity is permitted to alter land boundaries without federal certification or an independent survey. Violations will be treated as deliberate legal fraud. In other words, from a small wooden sign posted at the edge of a plot, an entire system was forced to reconsider how it made decisions, how it dismissed details, and how its confidence had turned careless. And in every analysis, every comparison, the 191 map didn't fade with time. Instead, it emerged more clearly as a boundary not just of geography, but of transparency and accountability. The land, once denied legal recognition, now redefining the limits of the entire system. A week after the Parcel 191 map was selected as the reference model for verifying boundaries across 3 counties, a state-level hearing was held in the main legislative chamber. Seats were full, the hearing tables lined up neatly, microphones adjusted with care, and legislators sat in groups by specialty, their eyes shifting between caution and admission of fault. Elior didn't sit in the center with state representatives. He was invited to the witness chair and responded to every greeting with a simple nod. A large screen behind him displayed a prominent clip from 5 weeks earlier, the private land, Parcel 191 sign being reinstalled in steel, cut-resistant and solid, on land that had once been encroached upon. An older senator, silver-haired and deep-voiced but sharp, looked straight at Elior and said, "Some people stay silent to avoid blame, some stay silent to preserve integrity, and some stand still, not because they're weak, but because where they stand is strong enough to expose where the law has bent." No applause followed, no gasps, but the room seemed to compress under the weight of that sentence. A brief admission, but heavy enough to press against the system itself. Elior nodded slightly, not out of thanks, and not from discomfort. He glanced through the large window to his right, where the section of iron fence had just been rebuilt along the original marker line, stretching across the old slope like a thin thread that could not be crossed. At that very spot, nearly 40 years earlier, His father, also an engineer, had driven the first stake to mark the family's land, using the brightest red paint he could find on the wooden edge, marked with a handwritten symbol. The photo from that day still sat in the technical file Elior carried, now transferred into the Federal Archive and stamped Verified Land Marker, 1985 Original Survey Record. And today, the state government had accepted it as part of its official reference material, something that, until now, the polished, heavily edited maps had tried so hard to bury. State attorneys whispered among themselves about a set of amendments being drafted to require all future technical maps to include verified origins, stored in the federal system for a minimum of 20 years. Some dormant bills on residential project audits were also brought back into discussion proposals that had been suspended for 5 years due to the lack of standardized records. And oddly enough, the new standard didn't come from any national planning agency, but from a hand-drawn map, a wooden sign once threatened with removal, and a man once labeled as an obstacle to development. When the hearing ended, no one shook Elior's hand. Not out of dislike, but because no one dared break the silence he was holding. They walked past him, nodded, or avoided his gaze, as if trying to grasp how one person could stay true to himself, while the entire system chose to forget him. And he stood there, eyes still fixed on that distant piece of land, where his father once told him, "You don't need to prove anything, just stay in the right place, so what's wrong will reveal itself on its own." In that moment, people understood that no matter how many documents get amended, no matter how many organizations are dissolved, what truly forces a system to change doesn't come from pressure, but from the silent and steady presence of a boundary and a person who never stepped away from it. Right after the hearing ended, the HOA office issued a brief statement. Celia Thorn officially stepped down from all positions related to the Heritage Bluffs project and all subcommittees on community planning. No press conference, no farewell, not even a line of thanks from her colleagues, just a file quietly submitted, titled Internal Review, Confidential. But just hours later, an excerpt from that review appeared in several local newspapers. A quiet yet pointed sentence stood out beneath the headline, "I thought he would give up. I didn't think he could make the whole system look at a map again." That was the only line the press chose to print in bold, as if they knew no explanation was needed. No one could say for certain if Celia wrote it herself or if it was drafted by a media consultant, but the broken phrasing, hovering between regret and resentment, seemed unmistakably hers. That afternoon, the Ledger published an in-depth analysis titled, "One Man Kept His Land, One System Lost Its Footing." In it, an attorney directly involved in the case, writing under the initials R.A. Winford, calmly stated, "We didn't lose to the law. We lost because we underestimated the value of a single line." No further quote was needed. The entire article circled around one narrow principle. The strength of law doesn't lie in how thick the legal code is, but in the willingness to stand accountable for every line drawn, even on land once dismissed as worthless. Elior did not appear after that. No victory speech, no gratitude ceremony, and certainly no celebration. Neighbors said they still saw him going to work as usual, driving the same old pickup, stopping by the hardware store every Friday morning, and pausing for about 3 minutes in front of the private land, parcel 191 sign on his way home, which now had a small new plate beneath it engraved, "Preserved by Original Record, Federally Verified." For most people, what happened was now a matter of archives and summary articles. But for those who had once stayed silent as the sign was taken down, then watched it go back up in steel, it marked a turning point that could not be undone. Because of that silence, they understood that a system doesn't need to collapse through protests or appeals. It can be overturned by the very principle it once ignored. And from that moment on, the story was no longer about who won, but about what would no longer be tolerated. No one read Celia's review aloud, even though it was published in full on the court's website. Not because people didn't care, but because most had already found what mattered in the very first line. Phrases like, "I thought he would give up," or "I didn't think he could," revealed the entire blind spot of a system that once operated under the belief that power was always right, that silence meant surrender. But this time, it was the quiet resolve of one engineer and a hand-drawn map from 3 decades ago that brought the law back to its course and forced the entire machine to stop just to check how far off track it had gone. And sometimes, as that whispered confession in the review admitted, a single line, if drawn correctly, can become the boundary everyone has to reckon with. Elior left the courthouse in the fading afternoon light, carrying nothing but a small canvas bag of tools. Reporters crowded the entrance, cameras pointed at him, but he walked straight through without stopping. One journalist called out, "Do you have anything to say to the community?" He didn't turn back, didn't respond. Perhaps the answer wasn't in words. Over an hour later, Elior was seen parking by the old plot of land, where the private land sign had once been pulled down, mocked, and used as a pretext by an entire system that chose the wrong boundary. He opened the truck bed, took out the sign that had been removed before the hearings began, gently placed it on a small wooden stool, and wiped it clean every mark, every rain stain left from months ago. No one filmed the act, no television crew waited, but every movement Elior made was as precise as the way he once measured each land coordinate. Steady, thorough, nothing extra, nothing missing. After cleaning it, he carefully reinstalled the sign in its original place, at the very post his father had set in 1985. A new cord was tied securely, not too tight, not too loose. He checked the angle, stepped back 3 paces, then took a marking pen from his jacket pocket, knelt down, and wrote a line on the back of the sign where only he could see it, unless someone chose to take it down and read. The handwriting tilted slightly, familiar, not etched with anger or bitterness. "This is a boundary not to divide, but to remind us to be honest." Not long after, a local resident walking near the development site passed by and saw Elior still standing there, quietly watching the newly restored fence line. That person later recalled that Elior didn't seem to be waiting for anything, nor did he look like someone who had just won. He looked like a caretaker of something that didn't belong to him, but somehow needed his protection more than anyone else's. And that moment when someone chose to restore what others had tried to erase became a symbol, a boundary no longer marking just land, but the divide between 2 ways of acting, one that believes laws can bend to convenience, and one that believes integrity should be held, even if held alone. That sign remained just as it was, never replaced with steel, never added onto, still the old piece of wood bearing the clear words, "Private land, parcel 191. But people knew that behind it, beneath the plain wooden surface, was a line of text that only needed to be read once to never be forgotten. And that alone made those who passed through, engineers, planners, new residents, former HOA members, pause for a few seconds before moving on. Because sometimes, what makes us change isn't a verdict, a lawsuit, or a hearing. It's the act of someone choosing to hold a boundary not to separate people, but to remind us that dignity lies not in defeating someone, but in never stepping away from what was right from the beginning. Becca stood in the living room of house number 77, the late afternoon light filtering through the newly installed window glass. Behind her was the mailbox, still missing a nameplate, and in front, an unfinished stone-paved yard. But she wasn't in a hurry to fix it, nor to leave. After weeks of upheaval, claims for compensation, and neighborhood meetings heavy with accusations, Becca chose a path few dared to stay but not to avoid. In a local press meeting, when asked why she didn't countersue to recover her full deposit, she replied, "I've set foot on this land. Now I have to move forward like an adult, not like a victim." Instead of demanding her house back or blaming the system, she reached out to a lawyer and proposed signing an official land lease with the rightful owner, Elior Maris. In the draft she sent, she wrote clearly, "I don't see you as the loser or the winner. I see you as someone who held your rightful place, even when everyone else wanted you to leave it." A few days later, Becca received a handwritten letter, not from a law office, not stamped by any court, just a brown envelope, clean script, and the signature E. Maris in the bottom left corner. In it, Elior wrote, "I don't need you to move out. I need you to acknowledge what you're standing on and live with it as a responsibility." No conditions, no figures named, just a single sentence that made Becca pause before tucking the letter into her desk drawer. Their story, a homebuyer who was never informed of a dispute and a landholder dragged into a legal battle, began circulating online as another example of how dialogue can happen outside the lines of confrontation. A short video showed Becca walking into the yard, replanting a shrub that had withered from neglect. It was shared thousands of times with a simple caption, "She didn't tear up the tiles, she fixed the roots." The comments were split. Some called her naive for choosing to stay on land still fraught with legal risk, but many saw her as a symbol of what the entire neighborhood needed to relearn the ability to acknowledge what went wrong and continue living truthfully instead of denying it. A week later, the number 77 was officially affixed to the wooden post at the front of the yard. Just below it, in small but clear letters, Becca engraved an additional line, "Land by Elior Maris," not to make a statement and not to prove anything, She told neighbors that the inscription was for herself, so she would never forget that while the roof above belonged to her, the ground beneath once belonged to someone else, and that being able to keep living there was a privilege to be honored, not a right to be clung to. From house number 77, a group of residents began meeting again, no longer under the old HOA name, but as the Community for the Preservation of Legal Boundaries. The goal wasn't to exclude anyone, but to relearn the processes, limits, and responsibilities between land, people, and authority. Becca became the first member who wasn't an engineer, didn't have a legal background, but was invited to serve as the public representative because she was the first to choose to stay on disputed land with transparency, without erasure, without turning away, and without asking to be forgiven. House number 77 still stood there, no different in structure from the surrounding homes, yet it became a soft period mark in a long line of tense dashes of power, error, and confrontation. And perhaps, within a project once suspended due to boundary violations, the first surviving home was not one built to make a statement, but to remind us that the safest thing humans can create is the way they choose to handle the truth. Becca's actions quickly moved beyond house number 77. Within 3 weeks, 12 other residents, mostly those who had once been anxious and filed complaints, feeling deceived, voluntarily contacted Elior to request new, legal land lease agreements. No one was forced, no names were mentioned in the press, and Elior never spoke of them publicly. The meetings happened quietly, mostly in the wooden house at the edge of the land that he had set up as a temporary citizen office. Each person arrived with a different reason, some afraid of losing their homes, others wanting to avoid legal conflict, but all left with the same agreement. They formally acknowledged the land belonged to Elior Maris, and agreed to pay a symbolic rent, as a way of affirming rightful status. That voluntary act gradually turned what was once labeled a legal dispute zone into the first residential community in the district with clear legal terms. No sale contracts were voided, and no resident was forced to leave. Instead, all documents were updated as bilateral agreements signed, mapped, and with annexes stating that they had unintentionally built on land that wasn't theirs. What moved everything forward wasn't a court order, but the courage to face the truth from those who had once stood on the wrong side. On a land law forum, a short status appeared and was shared thousands of times. They weren't forced to leave. They were invited to stay with the truth. That simple line spread not because of its style, but because it struck a nerve the system had long ignored. People don't fear change, they fear being labeled the problem if they try to make things right. Beneath it, residents from other regions began commenting, asking how to check land boundaries, how to verify coordinates. Some young lawyers even proposed drafting a handbook on property rights and communal responsibility to distribute at future civic meetings across the district. Elior didn't take on any leadership role in the newly formed community. He simply continued doing what he had been doing for months, showing up when technical verification was needed, responding to letters about land surveys, and firmly declining all invitations to speak to the media. In one rare instance, when asked why he didn't use this opportunity to file a lawsuit for damages, he replied, "I've never seen anyone redraw a map with money. I've only seen people do it with honesty." That line, once again, was shared not as a legal statement but as a moral one. In a system that prioritized rapid development and investment returns, a single engineer choosing to preserve a boundary, instead of erasing it for more land, had created a shift in perspective, forced the entire local real estate sector to pause and reflect. The homes were left intact, the contracts rewritten, and Parcel 191, a plot once dismissed as an obstacle to a multi-million-dollar project, now stood as a model for addressing errors through dialogue instead of denial. From a wooden sign staked at the edge of a construction site to 12 re-signed contracts, the story slowly moved away from the legal dispute narrative to become a process of changed understanding that justice doesn't need to dominate, it just needs not to be ignored. And while the press continued to dig into Celia's misconduct, the residents chose to rewrite the way they lived on the very land they once mistakenly thought was theirs. No one stayed out of bitterness. They stayed, this time with full awareness and a commitment that boundaries are not places to divide, but places to measure one's integrity. Elior sat upright, the studio light casting shadows across his high-bridged nose and tired eyes, worn from months of dispute, yet still carrying the quiet depth of someone who had never once stepped back. The host tilted his head, waiting, half-jokingly asking whether, if given the choice again, Elior would install an iron fence or a stone wall to avoid the mess that had unfolded. Elior gave a faint smile, not looking at the camera but instead at his hands resting on his knees. He answered, "If I had to do it again, I'd still put up the same wooden post my father once did. Because what needs protecting isn't the land, it's the line between what's right and what's convenient." The host paused, then nodded, and didn't ask further. A clip from the interview later went viral on social media, gaining over 1 million views in 3 days, captioned, "He didn't set a trap, the system walked into it." No one expected a minor boundary dispute to shake the foundation of multiple zoning projects and a local governance model, but Ellier never treated the outcome as a personal victory. Throughout the process, he never used harsh language, never shamed anyone, and never leveraged public opinion to retaliate. Every step he took, posting the sign, submitting the map, filing the forms, removing, and then replacing the sign, was quiet and deliberate, as if every strike of his hammer into the boundary post simply said, "I'm still here." When asked why he didn't file a lawsuit from the start, he replied, "Because I wanted to give them a chance to stop themselves." That sentence revealed another layer of the story, that what some called the trap wasn't laid by a quiet engineer, but was the result of a series of oversights, a systemic carelessness, a belief in unchecked power that forgot what that power was supposed to rest on. They weren't tricked, they were pulled into error by their own lack of verification and their casual arrogance. Online, people began comparing this story to major scandals in the real estate sector, not to exaggerate it, but to highlight this: the truth doesn't need traps, it only needs patience, while the careless walk right into it. A Twitter post read, "The scariest trap is the one no one set, but you step into it thinking you're above the law." That quote became the most shared line of the week, appearing in legal analyses and everyday reflections posted by citizens. Inside the suspended housing development, some residents started hanging small signs by their doors. "I live here because I know where I stand." These signs weren't distributed by Ellier, weren't part of any campaign, and weren't confrontational in tone. They were simply declarations of personal responsibility. When a reporter asked Ellier what he thought of it, he replied, "This land was never mine unless I could prove it." As for them, they're holding on to their part, not the land, but their commitment to the truth. From the boundaries that were once erased without thought, even the smallest fences now stand as proof of something greater, that people do not coexist merely by contract, but through a shared understanding of what belongs to whom and why that deserves respect. There were no scoldings, no dramatic collapses, but the way Ellier never compromised, never gave in, and never sought revenge, forced those who once challenged him to sit down, flip through every document, and ask themselves, when did we start thinking we could cross a line without anyone noticing? And the answer didn't come from the court, but from an engineer who held firm to the boundary stake his father had planted. When Ellier was asked once more what he believed the HOA's biggest mistake was, he looked straight into the camera, not with coldness, not with triumph, but with the calm of someone who had weathered a storm. He said, "I would still use a wooden sign, because what holds the truth isn't the material, it's the will not to step back." The response was simple, but it seemed to settle every argument. Not because wood is the strongest, and not because it symbolizes permanence, but because wood rots if left uncared for, and it's easy to knock over if no one stands beside it. But when driven in by someone who refuses to retreat, it can endure as a real boundary between what's right and what's convenient, between what belongs to someone and what others want to take. Beneath the clip, a pinned comment with hundreds of thousands of likes read, "The best trap is the one the greedy walk into on their own." A line sharp as a blade, not bitter, but enough to silence a room. The comment didn't name anyone, but everyone knew who it was about. Those who altered coordinates, who laughed when the wooden sign tilted in the wind, who insisted the land has been regularized, they had all stepped into a misalignment they thought no one would catch. They thought the man would quit after the legal warnings, after being smeared, after being banned from his own property. They believed silence would bury the truth. But what they didn't see was that his silence wasn't a compromise. It was watchfulness, patience, and a way to let every wrong move surface clearly, when there was no longer a way out. Ellier's story spread not just through planning forums but also entered land law classes as a case study on the weight of small evidence and the power of someone who never abandoned their role. No force, no political backing, no media campaign, just a wooden sign with hand-painted letters was enough to mark a real boundary, one that made an entire system stop, recheck the map, and reconsider itself. When a local television station aired a special report on the case, they didn't lead with legal commentary. They opened with footage of the humble sign, freshly cleaned and rehung in its original place, then cut to a scene of new residents standing and reading the inscription on the back. This is a boundary not to divide, but to remind us to be honest. A planning expert featured in that program said, "That sign doesn't have a file number, no technical drawings attached, but it did what stacks of permits couldn't. It made people stop. Because they could argue about square footage, about coordinates, about clauses, but no one could argue with someone who didn't run from his own boundary." Ellier never stepped on stage for applause. He simply held a position, the place where the truth had once been pushed aside, but now had been put back where it belonged. His final act wasn't a speech, but a faint smile when the camera stopped, and a hand resting on the wooden sign like someone closing the last page of an old chapter. That chapter had no final ruling on who won or lost, but one thing was clear: every system, no matter how big, if built on deceit, won't need anyone to tear it down. It will collapse on its own when faced with someone persistent enough not to step back, and sometimes, the one seen as a problem turns out to be the only one who never damaged the foundation of trust. At the county land office on a quiet morning, the new map was printed on heavy paper, the boundary of parcel 191 appearing clearly, like a marker that had waited years for official recognition. Beneath the map were signatures from 3 departments: land records, planning, and legal, formalizing full and independent ownership of the marked area by Elior Maris, based on the original designation from 1985. There was no press conference, no flashing signs, no cheering, just a small sign placed back where it had once been uprooted. Private land, parcel 191. One office clerk remarked while stamping the file, "Strange. A wooden stake could beat an entire system." Another replied, "Not the stake." The person holding it didn't give up. The news spread quickly. Many articles no longer focused on who was wrong, but instead shifted to what someone right had to do: hold a boundary, regardless of timing or pressure, based solely on legal foundation. An urban planning conference held in Trenton used the case as a core example, titled plainly, pointedly, "A private citizen can win if they understand the law and their limits." The keynote speaker, director of a public-private land research institute, pointed at a diagram and said, "No one is required to fight an entire system, but anyone can make the system pause if they prove they haven't stepped beyond what is theirs." That quote was shared widely, opening many commentary shows. It didn't glorify confrontation. It reminded people that in tangled legal situations, what matters most isn't new law, but a person unwilling to step away from what is already right. Elior never asked others to leave, never demanded they demolish all structures, never used rulings to push back a community. He simply held the land his father once marked, and asked for the respect due to any boundary, no matter how small, not something to step over and explain away later. When asked if he wanted to seek compensation from the government or from those who had built unlawfully, he answered briefly, "I never wanted what wasn't mine. I just want what I kept true from the beginning returned the same way." The atmosphere around the old project zone gradually shifted. The homes no longer displayed "for sale" signs at the gate, but instead had small placards showing plot numbers and a line stating their legal status had been updated. Some owners even noted, "This land is legally leased from the recognized owner by the county." It wasn't a declaration of victory, it was proof of an agreement built on a new understanding, that keeping land isn't only about owning property, it's about carrying the responsibility and dignity that come with it. The Parcel 191 case came to be remembered not for how loud it was, but for restoring something essential to the system: the binding power of truth, when preserved long enough by someone who stayed out of drama, didn't want to defeat anyone, but also refused to be lumped in with the rest. Celia Thorn disappeared from meetings, and news outlets no longer mentioned her as a representative of the HOA, but as a cautionary tale about the limits of power when it's placed in the wrong hands. A few people who had once opposed Elior now began writing letters, requesting private meetings to clarify adjoining boundaries. He always responded with the same handwritten line, never printed: "I don't hold land to build fences, but to remind that each person is responsible for the path they walk." No one ever replied to that message. They understood that silence was the only fitting response to a truth already proven beyond argument. And the wooden sign, once pulled down and replaced many times, now stood still as a final reply to everything that had happened. There is no need to give back everything, only what rightfully belongs to someone else. Celia moved in with her family in a quiet suburb to the south, away from press inquiries and evening broadcasts that still occasionally mentioned her name. The small house with oak trees out front didn't resemble the home of someone who once approved hundreds of development projects across the county. She left a thick envelope at her former office. Inside was a handwritten letter, brief but compelling enough for professionals to study line by line. "I used to think I was building solid communities," she wrote, "but I didn't realize I'd built them on a flawed legal foundation by dismissing a faint red line on a map I thought didn't matter." Public reaction didn't label it as remorse, nor did they rush to call it redemption, but it marked the definitive end of an era once assumed unshakable, solid as the concrete foundations poured over land that had never been properly verified. The following year's training manual for land surveyors included a new section. It opened with the original map of Parcel 191, bearing the 1985 federal verification signature next to a photograph of the wooden fence, the private land sign, and Ellier's handwritten note on the back. This is a boundary not to divide, but to remind us to be honest. The manual didn't dissect who was right or wrong in specific acts. It offered just one red-inked footnote at the bottom of the page. No boundary is too small to overlook. It wasn't an emotional appeal, it was a professional reminder that minor errors can lead to major cracks, and that leniency with a line on a map can bring down an entire legal framework without making a sound. Many engineering students said they paused longer on that one map, not because it was complex, but because it proved the consequences of underestimating lines meant to protect, not obstruct. Training institutions and legal agencies began incorporating the story into seminars not to glorify a winner, but to reflect both sides of a system, one where a single person standing still and holding on to the truth can stop an entire chain of deliberate cover-ups. A senior lecturer at a university in North Texas remarked, "We have thousands of maps, but the lesson is this. Does anyone still believe in their accuracy? And who will be the one to preserve their true value when the system forces them to look the other way?" That question doesn't need a collective answer. It only needs someone like Ellior, who once quietly walked out of a courtroom without making a statement, without asking for compensation, without demanding credit, yet compelled an entire profession to re-examine how it defines what's rightfully placed. From a wooden sign dismissed as a nuisance, from an engineer once labeled an obstacle to development, from a case once considered a minor dispute, the story gradually became a turning point in how public agencies regard boundaries and the true worth of each survey. When a system has to revise itself not out of pressure but because it can no longer deny the accuracy upheld by someone who never strayed from the reason those lines exist, it's no longer a lawsuit, it becomes a process of maturation. Celia, in her quiet withdrawal, became part of that process too. No one refers to her anymore as the chief architect of the HOA, but many privately reread her final letter as a personal reminder that the collapse of a system doesn't come from one wrong act, but from a long chain of careless nods towards small things everyone assumed someone else would check. And from a boundary once thought meaningless, they began to relearn the value of facing the truth even when it wasn't part of the plan. 1 year after the final hearing, Ellior walked his young son along the edge of the land, once a disputed boundary, now marked with official county posts, freshly painted yellow, and tagged with survey IDs and verification dates. The grass had grown evenly, the wooden fence replaced with stainless steel, and the private land sign still stood no longer controversial. The boy stopped at the northwest corner of the lot, near a stone plaque by an oak tree, and asked, "Why did that man say this was his land?" Ellior crouched down, rested his hand on the metal plate, and replied softly but clearly, "Because they were used to thinking silence meant yes, and for years, no one spoke up at the right time." That sentence wasn't just for the child, it summed up Ellior's entire journey, a confrontation not fought with shouting or protests, but by standing still, letting silence become a landmark no one could ignore. His father's old map still hung in his study, unchanged since 1985. But now, it was no longer just proof of ownership, it had become a symbol of something greater than legal standing, the power to force an entire system to recheck itself. The simple red ink lines, once dismissed as incompatible with modern zoning, were now standard across 3 adjacent counties and integrated into the state's planning database as a benchmark reference. Surveying classes began their lectures with the story of Parcel 191, not as a case study, but as a reflection. When the truth holds still and firm long enough, it doesn't need defending only not to be erased. Ellior accepted no awards, gave no speeches at professional conferences, and turned down a major publisher's offer to write a memoir. He sent a single-line email, "I didn't hold this land to retell what went wrong, I held it to remind people what's right." After a year of backing away from the legal turmoil that once shook the local construction industry, the media returned on a spring morning. A reporter captured Ellior planting a small sign at the base of the new fence. "This boundary has been here a long time. It's just now, people stopped to read it." The caption went viral not because it was dramatic, but because it echoed something simple. Truth doesn't need to be loud, only seen without looking away. In the southern blocks of Heritage Bluffs, where some houses had once overlapped Ellior's land, new contract notices were now posted. Some residents had moved out, others signed lease agreements, a quiet admission of past mistakes, and a choice to continue living with clarity. Ellior's story didn't end with reclaiming every inch of land, but with staying consistent in how he walked across it. No bitterness, no retreat, and no bending of principles just to make life easier. His son held his hand, not yet understanding it all, but already sensing the difference between someone who defends a boundary and someone who exploits the silence around it. Those who once stood with the HOA gradually stepped down. New elections required transparent planning records, and the standard of independent verification became mandatory instead of optional. What seemed like a personal boundary had shifted the entire system's perspective, not through aggressive legal tactics, but through the steady presence of someone who chose to believe in the accuracy of a hand-drawn line from 3 decades ago. The map hadn't changed, but the way people looked at it no longer stayed the same. And through all that change, Elier kept moving quietly forward, leaving behind words that didn't need to be bolded, because it was how he kept them intact that made them unforgettable. "So what did you do, Dad?" the child asked, eyes fixed on the old map, now framed neatly on the living room wall. It was the original parcel map Elier Maris had submitted to the planning office, with a bold red hand-drawn outline marking parcel 191, and a small note at the bottom, "Leave intact. Do not blur." Elier placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice calm, but settling into the room like long-settled dust. "I kept it the same, so one day you won't have to argue, just point to the truth." His words held no triumph, no lesson. They were simply how he chose to protect something unchangeable with words, a line of ink from the past, strong enough to make the present stop. Elier's journey, from a quiet engineer replanting an old wooden sign to someone who made an entire planning system reassess its definition of legal land, was never a public battle. He didn't call for protests, didn't speak in heated tones during interviews, and never claimed to be right in front of crowds. He simply fulfilled the role of a son, a landowner, a citizen who refused to let his father's memory be paved over in silence. And what made people stop wasn't a declaration, but the unwavering consistency of repeated acts: planting a sign, submitting paperwork, staying silent when needed, responding when it mattered, refusing to compromise without causing harm. After full recognition, Parcel 191 became more than a private plot. It became the only area in the region labeled a reference boundary, meaning all future projects had to align with it to avoid mistakes. Elier received no formal honors for that designation, but professionals in the field understood one thing clearly. Had he shifted the line even once, moved the fence, or accepted a new coordinate, that boundary would have vanished into the blur of redrawn maps like so many others before it. New residents who re-signed lease agreements would glance at the steel sign each time they passed. Some paused, nodding slightly, not because anyone asked, but because they understood that the place they now lived in was the result of a moral verification. No one had been forced to leave, just asked to stand in the right spot, see the line, and live with it. The Heritage Bluffs project was now down to 103 homes. The rest had been removed, rezoned into an open conservation area, with a sign at the entrance reading, "Once disputed land, now where transparency begins." Some residents suggested renaming the entire zone, but Elier declined. "We don't need to rewrite history, just make sure we don't repeat it." The story ends not with triumph. No scene of someone bowing an apology before a judge or exchanging reconciliatory handshakes. It closes with a boundary being respected, not out of compulsion, but because, in the end, the truth was remeasured by an entire society, from surveyors to inspectors, from lawyers to homebuyers. And that very boundary, once seen as something that could be overlapped, blurred, or pushed aside, had become the center of a quiet shift, sparked by one person who chose to hold on to something no one was obligated to keep, but if lost, everything else would fail to stand. Elier didn't win by suing anyone. He won by keeping what was right intact, so that one day, his son could simply point to a map and others would have no choice but to nod. In the soft afternoon light, the steel sign reading "Private Land" still stood not as a warning anymore, but as a quiet witness to a journey from silence to clarity. The story had begun with something seemingly small, a wooden boundary post overlooked, a plot of land infringed upon by the haste of an organization that believed power could substitute for responsibility. Elier Maris, a quiet engineer living on land his father left behind, never intended to become the center of a public dispute. The only thing he did was put the wooden sign back, not to block anyone, but to remind them that some lines can't be erased with a redrawn diagram or an administrative excuse. The confrontation came from Celia Thorn, the lead coordinator of the Heritage Bluffs project and the face of an HOA that believed a few layered maps and legal procedures could turn any land into commercial property. But the system she led made the one mistake the law cannot ignore: building on land that didn't belong to them, then deliberately trying to obscure it with technical loopholes and administrative pressure. When Elier first said no, not through a megaphone, but by keeping the original wooden marker in place, the system reacted with threats, bribery, accusations, and eventually banning him from accessing his own land. But each act of force only brought the truth further into the light. A leaked video, an engineer speaking up, a homebuyer asking a question, and layer by layer, the system revealed its own fragile seams. It all began with one simple question: whose land is this? And it ended with a map recognized as a model of authenticity, not because it was complex, but because it remained untouched by any interest. The handwritten note Ellier's father once left on the back of that map, "Hold the boundary. Don't let silence blur the law," became the guiding principle for the entire journey, needing no long speeches, just a refusal to shift. Throughout the entire series of events, Ellior never appeared as a movement leader. He didn't launch a media campaign, didn't organize protests, didn't issue sweeping declarations. All he did was file petitions, engage in lawful dialogue, respond to accusations with technical evidence, and, most importantly, maintain the same calm resolve as the boundary he defended. That calm made the difference, not because it was persuasive, but because it couldn't be pulled into emotional noise. And in a society overwhelmed by reaction speed and viral momentum, that steadiness became a reliable anchor for decisions to be reconsidered. Celia Thorn and many HOA members eventually stepped down, not because any outside force pushed them, but because the very system they had helped operate reflected back the mistakes they tried to hide. When Ellior stood as a witness in court, he didn't talk about himself. He simply held up the map his father had left, pointed to the hand-marked section, and delivered a message that couldn't be denied. It wasn't a personal confrontation. It was the moment a system was forced to listen to what it had once dismissed as minor issues: a boundary line, a wooden sign, a man who refused to trade his signature for silence. From that case, many lessons were rewritten into planning documents, technical training manuals, and legal workshops. But the most meaningful lesson wasn't in writing. It was in how Ellior answered his son's question: "What did you do?" "I kept it the same, so one day you won't have to argue. Just point to the truth." In a world where everyone wants to argue, refute, assert, and claim the moral high ground, that answer made people pause. Because sometimes, what's right doesn't come from the strongest logic, but from the refusal to back down from what you know is right, even when you stand alone. People often say justice must be protected by law, but Ellior's story shows that sometimes justice survives because someone refused to step away. Not for the sake of winning or losing, but because if everyone looks the other way, the line between right and wrong eventually fades. The private land sign, then, is no longer just a property marker. It has become a symbol of quiet resistance, not aimed at anyone, not retaliatory, not dramatic, but persistent and impossible to ignore. This story inspires not because Ellior is a hero, but because he didn't choose the easy path. He didn't earn respect with achievements, but by holding on to something simple under enormous pressure. He didn't just protect land, he protected a principle: that the law doesn't need glorifying, it just needs to be applied correctly. And society doesn't need to be led by lofty voices, but by people patient enough not to lose their balance. In an era where every conflict can quickly become news, where victory is often decided by who reacts faster, louder, or more forcefully, Ellior Maris chose to step back, hold a boundary stake, and stay still. But it was that very stillness that forced the entire system to shift, not to avoid, but to correct itself. And that is why, even though his map never changed, society's view of boundaries, of fairness, of integrity, was no longer the same. Not because they were persuaded, but because they could no longer deny it. Not because they were taught, but because they witnessed it. And the final lesson left by that story may be the simplest of all. The truth doesn't need to win. It only needs someone to hold it long enough for everything else to adjust on its own.